All right, great. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us here for this panel on eugenic histories and presence. Thank you, of course, to Jamie for all the tech support over these days, and to Shelley Tremaine for bringing us all together and creating spaces online like this one. Um, my name is Erica. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a PhD candidate in philosophy at the University of Washington in Seattle. I study bioethics, including clinical ethics, disability, emotions, and technology. I am a 30-year-old white woman with shoulder length brown wavy hair, excuse me, wearing a black shirt with a brown and black sweater over it and a necklace with small gold pendants. As some reminders, you can turn on captions by clicking the tab on the bottom of the window and can adjust the size of those captions as needed. Questions for the presenters can be put into the Q&A box, which I'll be monitoring. And if a question, presses you during either of the talks, feel free to write it as it arises, especially if you, like me, are worried about forgetting in the course of the presentation. Um, so we have two fantastic speakers on this panel. I'll start by introducing the first one. First up, we have Dr. Tommy J. Curry, a philosopher and social and political theorist who holds the personal chair in Africana philosophy and Black male studies at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. His research interests are 19th century ethnology, critical race theory, and Black male studies, a field that he's often credited with founding. Dr. Curry is the author of two acclaimed books, including 2017's The Man Not, Race, Class, Genre, and the Dilemmas of Black Manhood, and countless other works of scholarship. And his presentation today is titled Not of Man, the Ethnological Foundations of Racial Difference in the 19th Century. So Dr. Curry, whenever you're ready.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Excellent. So first off, thank everyone for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to present at this conference. I'm a Black man who is increasingly graying in my mid 40s. I am wearing a gray sweater to try to match with the gray hair that's coming in. And I have glasses now, so that's the upgrade from last year or the last few years. I'm going to try to be quick, but I want to try to cover this as comprehensively as possible. The name of my presentation is Not of Man, the Ethnological Foundations of Racial Difference in the 19th Century. This is a project that I've been working on for years. I'm one of the few philosophers that actually specialize in 19th century ethnology. I want to begin by briefly giving us an understanding of what ethnology is. Ethnology was the science of physicality was based on the lineage of men. Knowledge was a scientific inquiry based on the belief that the physical body, in fact, revealed moral and political capacities of its owner, and by implication, those of his or her race writ large. So the slavery question formed the backdrop for antebellum ethnology and likewise shaped its major themes and general points of emphasis. Men emerged as the central subject in the context of a scientific discourse, largely dedicated to establishing hierarchical taxonomies of race that drew on biblical accounts of the descent of man through a series of ancient patriarchs. So the ethnologists, for instance, about American ethnology, preoccupied with the male lineage of racists and questioned whether blacks were sons of Adam. This was in fact used as the basis of deciding whether or not black people deserved equality. But what I want to show is that the American antebellum ethnological tradition was in many ways superseded by a tradition that in the UK. Duke Stewart was one of the first people who started exploring the relationship between complexion and moral character during the Scottish Enlightenment. So he was the chair of moral philosophy in 1785, and of course, resigned in what we discovered going through some of Dougal's archives and student notes from 1793 to 1794 was that unlike the dominant view that we have the Scottish Enlightenment being quite separate from race theories in the United States or dealing with slavery, was very much teaching people here at the University of Edinburgh about race theories based slavery. So we're actually have a forthcoming article on the ethnological sciences and kind of ground zero here at the university. And what we wanted to contextualize was how he was using the notes and the debates between Thomas Jefferson's notes on the next to Samuel Stanhope Smith's essay on the cause of variety of complexion and figure in the human species from 1787. Now, remember, during this period of time, this was cutting edge research. Stewart actually concluded in this debate that from all that's been said, I think it appears that the argument for contiguity are stronger than those for the diversity of the human species. So Stewart was concerned with complexion and what complexion actually meant for mental fact. Now, between the two debates, had someone like Thomas Jefferson arguing for what some will call a polygenetic thesis, where Black people have a different origin. Stewart concluded or sided with Stanhope Smith. He fundamentally believed that there was one origin, one unified human species, and that we could account for the appearance of Black people through the variety of those racial differences, like climate and most importantly, civilization. So, what this quote here said from the notes of Google Stewart in 1793 and 94 is that the observations that they see on plantations really do confirm what Dr. Smith says of American slaves. Now, he believed that the field slaves in the United States were ill fed, ill clothed, and ill lodged. And what that meant is that the field slaves kept many of their unsightly African appearances, their stupid appearance, their flat noses, their thick lips, and woolly hair. Whereas the house slave, because they were interacting with whites, had a much more lively and beautiful expression. I'll discuss this a little later in the presentation, but he believed that as the interiority of the Black person changed, their physical appearance had to change. And this is largely based on the fact that Douglas Stewart a theoretical perspective of viewing bodies and objects called physiognomy. Now, we've only got two cents from his student notes on physiognomy. They come on the back of how he's like complexion and the interior of the face. Given the fact physiognomy was actually supported here at the University of Edinburgh and was part of the basis of the Phrenology Society that was founded in 1830. It's a really interesting find that he's lecturing during this period of time because remember, people like Kant in 1798 in his Pragmatic Anthropology had already rejected physiognomy, especially Lavater's view of physiognomy that was taken up throughout England and Great Britain. Stewart says it's known that man turned and is engaged in abstract metaphysical subject for a particular task which I has. The eye, when a person is engaged on certain subjects, fixes itself upon some object near the face. And this is important because continents and facial feature structures and appearances were really, really important. This is why Stewart, in that same lecture note, in those lecture notes, says when a great many ideas are moving in the mind, and consequently, it's easily from her face. The student that heard Dougal issues was James L. Pritchard, and he authored in the Physical History of Man in 1813. Now, actually credits Douglas Stewart with understanding the need for British ethnology. His first book in 1813, he says, look, the late professor of moral philosophy at the University of Edinburgh really kind of brought the inquiry into physical history of mankind into light. Now, what's important about Kyle Pritchard, and this is be necessary for how we understand the contrast with American ethnological tradition, is that for the British ethnologists, ethnology referred to the history of human races. It was interested in understanding their origins, the diversity of origins, questioning whether or not we all came from the same population, and the relationship we should have towards one another. Pritchard believed that we're the earliest form of humanity. Unlike American ethnologists, British ethnologists actually had a proto-evolutionary theory. They believed that the transmutation of the characters from Black people into those of European people. So there was evolution of white varieties in Black races of men. The Black people, because they started off as the base level, the base stock of people, did not get the benefit of social customs and the environment to develop civilization and actually have this become part of their connate qualities. So we can see from his work that he was an adamant follower of Stanhope Smith's state of nature arguments claims, and more broadly, common sense philosophy that we largely associate with someone like Thomas Reid. What's important about what Pritchard was doing is he's focused on the appearances of different races as uncivilized people. And he says that, look, when the result of this comparison is that there's little effect that's produced purely by the agency of climate alone upon savage tribes. Varieties indeed appear readily to spring up in a moderate than in intense hot climates, but they're not sufficient to produce any considerable change on the rating. Civilization, however, has more extensive powers. And we have examples of the greatest variation in the human complexion produced by it, or at least which can scarcely be referred to any other cause. And what's fascinating about this is he sees a lightning effect happen when people are introduced into civilization. Now, Stanhope Smith's argument's really interesting because even though he's writing in the late 1700s, he already believes that it's necessary for philosophers to focus their attention on Black people in the southern states of the United of America. He writes very clearly throughout his text that if we're trying to understand racial variation and the effect that civilization of the state of society has on groups of people, then it's going to be with Black people in the South that we best get the idea of this. Actually believes that the state of society is necessary to change the physical features of Black people. And this is really important because this not only provided a justification for British ethnological arguments for colonization, but it also, for Smith, tried to demonstrate that there is a unity in the human race and that it's not climate that's making certain kind of impressions and cognate qualities stick, but rather it's the state of the society. That once you're introduced to ideas of religion, morality, and manner, the complexion and the physiognomy of the person and the facial structure changes. The effect for him on the effect of this was pretty profound for Smith. He actually makes two distinctions in his work. He says, look, when you look at field slaves, right? Um, in comparison with the domestic, they're badly fed, they're badly clothed, they're badly lodged. They live together in small collections, and because of that, they retain many of the customs and features of their African ancestors. However, the domestics, right, who are near the masters, they have more elegance. Their facial features change, right? They acquire more regular and agreeable characteristics and expressive countenance, which can be formed only in the midst of a civilized society. So Smith actually has a statement where he says that the longer that enslaved Black people stick around white people, they become more beautiful and their hair becomes more manageable. Now, that articulation of ethnology from the British viewpoint is important to actually situate what happens in the United States. In the United States, ethnology focuses primarily in the antebellum period on biblical interpretations. And in these biblical interpretations, the stocks of men that you get for someone like a James Kyle Pritchard that are haven't evolved into these other states of variety and lighter skin are actually associated with demonology and the devil. So for someone like a Samuel Cartwright, ethnology is broken up into two different aspects. It's a science that's trying to discover the mental and moral characteristics of races, not simply their origin. As he says, the natural history of mankind is divided into two parts: ethnography and ethnology. The former will be passed over because it treats the physical difference among men, their geographical distribution, history, origin, etc. And the latter will only be considered, or that science which investigates the moral and mental differences among different groups of mankind searches for the law upon which they depend. So what you saw with someone like Cartwright, and you'll also see this with people like Buckner Payne, is that ethnology became a way to classify different races, but to also account for the laws or the guiding principles that are developing racial difference. And because ethnology was a science of men, men became the primary means by which these kinds of comparisons happen. Now, what's really important for this, the role that the Bible has in these interpretations. For someone like a Samuel Cartwright, he understood the Bible through the appearance of the Negro and his corruption of Eve in the Garden of Eden. So you have Samuel Cartwright answering back some of the arguments that you're getting from British theological or theologians like Clarke. or even trying to contradict the evolutionary claims that you get from someone like a James Kyle Pritchard. So Samuel Cartwright argued that Dr. Clark, who was a biblical historian from the UK, thought that an orangutan would have been a better choice than the serpent for the name of a black creature formed like man with the gift of speech and reason, a great deal of cunning, yet playful and good nature, walking erect, a sorcerer and a slave to something that charmed it. If the 72 had lived in our day, they would have rendered the word Nahash as the great Hebrew scholar of the East. But now with the West, C. Blanchard Thompson has rendered it by the Negro. So Samuel Cartwright asserts that it was actually a black man who could man and beguiled Eve into eating the apple. He says 50 years ago, Dr. Adam Clarke, the learned commentator of the Bible from deep reading in the Hebrew, Arabic, and Coptic languages, was forced to the conclusion that the creature which beguiled Eve was an animal formed like a man, walked upright, and had the gift of speech. He believed it was an orangutan and not a serpent. Had he lived in Louisiana instead of England, he would have recognized it as an equivalent. So that means that in their strategy, the black man, like the African before him, was thought to actually be the epitome and the materialization of a demon within American society. They believed that the difference in the origin of races was not simply based on uh, climate or geography as they would in the UK and other parts of the English speaking world, but was actually a manifestation of a certain kind of punishment, a lack of civilization, and really the beast, as pertained, as indicated by the Bible and indicated by the words of God in Genesis and after the Diluvian epoch. What's fascinating about this, however, is that these racial characteristics were thought to be so much removed from civilization that black men were thought to be naturally akin to murdering their wives and women. One of the arguments that Cartwright makes about slavery is that slavery actually protected black women from the savagery of black men. As you can see, he talks about how the king of Dahomey had for 3,000 wives, but he hated women so much that he actually lined the streets with their skulls. And he says that while the American Negro is somewhat removed from this, that black women are in fact not safe from the freedom of black men. So while they were in slavery, they've lost their white protectors, and while they and their husbands were in subordination to the white man, equal rights and equality among all the colored population, male and female, young and old, are sedulously maintained as indispensable in every plantation. All of which is lost to three-fourths of the black population, the women and children, by what is called Negro freedom. So you can see Cartwright making this argument that black men specifically had to be enslaved because they don't understand civilization and they're enemies of women. This view isn't actually new. It was widely shared and widely held during the ethnological period. When we look at Colonel Bucknell H. Payne's work, The Negro, What is His Ethnological Status? You see that he makes a very similar claim that was initially described in the definition of ethnology by Melissa Stein. Payne actually argues that the Negro was not a man. He was called man by Adam, not by God. And this distinction operates in numerous ethnological texts from the United States for 50 to 60 years following the Civil War. So it's not really until the turn of the 20th century that you start getting people completely abandoning this kind of antebellum and biblical interpretation of ethnology. But he says, look, but Mark, Adam did not name himself, for no child ever names himself. But God named him in his race, but he could not call or name him man after creating him. Adam's dominion, starting from himself, went downward on the scale of creation, while God's dominion, starting with Adam, went upward. God, foreseeing that Adam would call the Negro by the name man when he said, "Let us make man," therefore so used the term, for by such name man, the Negro was known by the flood, not by, but not as God would have named him. So, in the ideas of people like Paine, the only reason the black race existed was because the black man walked onto the ark as a beast, whereas Noah and his sons, Shem, Japheth, and Ham, were actually white men and part of the Adamitic race. So, what's fascinating about this is that the ethnological sciences of the day in the United States suggested that if we read the Bible, everything that Adam could name, he could rule over. And because he named the Negro man, right, speaking about black men in that way, he had divine right to rule over him. So when you had Noah's Ark, this is kind of the Diluvian epic that ethnologists often point to as the basis of creating different races around the world, as opposed simply to the Adamitic or what was claimed to be the white race by people like Samuel Cartwright and Buckner H. Green. That variation, right, was not based on the fact that the white race splintered into the other races, but that only God only created white men, and that every other race, like the black race, was just a beast that had the appearance of man that walked into the ark. So only being like Samuel Cartwright believed the black was the beast that tempted Eve. He's like the intelligent cannot fail to discover who was the tempter in the Garden of Eden. It was a beast, a talking beast, a beast naturally if it required a miracle to get talk. Um, and we're support. I learned Mr. Pose, and as no one could then perform a miracle by God, only if he performed this miracle to the snake, a serpent talk, and only talked to Eve, and that as soon as the serpent seduced Eve, eating the forbidden fruit, God then performed another miracle to stop him speaking afterward. Oh, he says that this is a contradiction, that God is both the immediate and direct author of cause of sin, an idea that cannot be admitted for one moment by any believer in the Bible. God called it a beast more than all the beasts the Lord God had made. As Adam was the federal head of all his posterity, as well as the real head, so was this beast, the Negro, the federal head of all beasts and cattle, down to creeping things, to all things that go up on the belly and eat dust all days of their lives. So I know I didn't have a lot of time to necessarily go through all the citations, etc. But what I've always found interesting about this claim is that when you have physiognomy being brought over to the UK, because it comes from Germany, from the debates with Johann Lavender, they're interested in complexion and beauty, and they see the black race, but especially black men, because they're looking at stocks of men as formulating a basis by which their outward appearance, their ugliness, their flat noses, and our woolly hair. These were thought to be not aesthetically pleasing features, and was an indication that Black people actually lacked civilization and the potential for civilization. The belief that people like Sam Stanhope Smith had in common sense philosophy that was picked up by people like Dougal Stewart and James Kyle Pritchard made it such that the contact with the white race changed their appearance. It made them lighter. It made them more beautiful. It made them more moral and more intelligent. This view was rejected by American ethnologists like Samuel Cartwright and Buckner Payne, and even people like John Van Every, because their view was that God didn't make a mistake in creation. They believed that the black man was a demon that operated as a beast and had brought was responsible for the fall of man and the Adamitic race. And what this presentation briefly demonstrates is both how the unsightliness and deformity of blackness was thought to exist as an opposite to whiteness, and more importantly, how throughout the 19th century we're not really talking about racism based on skin color. We're talking about racism as divisions of men, actual male bodies, and it doesn't really get taken up our fields of philosophy or even how we analyze the history of racism. So if we're looking at skin color, but not taking the time to actually trace what was said about the different groups of men, in quotes, that people were analyzing, we're largely missing the picture and not getting a really accurate analysis of what people were arguing from the 1780s all the way up to the 1920s. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Curry.
Well, maybe I will ask a question to start things off while people are sort of brewing over what Tommy has to say. So, Tommy, in the chat section, someone has said that has commented that this is so bizarre. But would you say that what you've talked about is so bizarre, or does it really fit into a larger historical political context?
Oh no, thank you for that. Yeah, I know ethnology sounds bizarre because it reverses everything that we think about how gender and sexuality operate. Um, but it fits into a larger context, especially in the work that I've done in Black male studies, because what it shows is that the creation of racial differences and stock differences, even when we go back to ethnography in Germany, is really based on how people are measuring differences between groups of men. And we traditionally don't look at it that way because the theories that we utilize, like intersectionality or even feminism, that deals with gender, don't really focus on male lineages. What's being shown here is that if you start from the beginning, right? So if you're going back to the archives that are here at the University of Edinburgh and Oxford, when these groups of white people, because there were men and women that actually wrote on this, but women a little later, wrote about racial differences, they were focused on one thing, whether or not stocks of men manifested the, if you're white, the most excellent qualities of evolution, and if you were not white, the most negative qualities of evolution. And this kind of chain of being was drawn for over 120 years purely by comparisons to groups of men. It's not until, at least in the United States, it's not until you get to, like, the end of slavery that you get any articulation of women playing a role in ethnology. And then in those debates, because you have them with people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Phoebe Cousins, those arguments place white women as being more manly and more masculine than black men. So what this does is it shows that because there are other groups of men that were excluded from humanity, it was a deliberate focus of ethnology to say that other racial groups of men were not like white men and were not like white women, that they were less masculine and more feminine. And this is, I think before I may have mentioned the Anne McClintock work, where she talks about how in 19th century ethnology, white women were even said and studied as more masculine than even the Zulu warrior. Race connoted the conditions of what we call gender now, because it was a question of who could be ruled. So it's really important for us, if we're being historically accurate in how our theories try to explain like the 17 and 1800s, we have to start incorporating our understanding of male lineage and patriarchy being based on that. Because one of the things that I didn't get to quote was how the Adamitic race, because God gave them dominion over the world, and because woman comes from Adam, that's what establishes God's notion of divine patriarchal authority. So people like Buckner Payne actually argue that even though black people are free now, God chooses to work through slave holding white men, that they're the ones that create discipline, institutions, civilization, and culture, and that it's white women reproducing that notion that actually keeps the beasts of the land like black men at bay. Right. So yeah, it's a much larger pattern that we can trace, not just through the 19th century, but even in the early 20th century social sciences like eugenics, or a lot of the work I do on mid 19th or mid 20th century work on subculture and violence theory.
Thank you. We have two questions that have come up now in the Q&A. The first is from John Henry, who says, "Thanks, Dr. Curry. That was an incredible presentation. A quick question on the reading of the Bible. Are they using a typological exegetical method while reading the Bible?"
Yes, yes. Um, because there much of the work, but this differs on both sides of the Atlantic. So if you're looking at someone like Adam Clark, they take a very textual and historical kind of view, like if you're in seminary, right? If you're looking at American ethnologists, they're trying to make sense of the manifestations of God. So the text becomes a way to interpret how history unveils itself. So you'll have someone like Buckner Payne say, listen, um, God, Ham, for instance, couldn't be cursed and turned black because there's never been an example of a curse in the Bible where the skin color of a person changed. And then he'll go through and he'll say, well, look, when you look at the Coptics, the Turks, etc., all these are races of people that have straight hair, not woolly hair. So they couldn't be Negroes. So you have both the textual exegesis, but you're trying to marry it as an explanative hermeneutic over historical events.
Thank you. We have another question from Kristen, who says, "I don't have the historical chops for this, but how does this fit with Sabrina String's work on feminine aesthetics and racial science from the 18th century, etc.? Very curious how this comes with or works together with this."
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm somewhat familiar with those arguments, but let me say this: there's a mistake, I think, of thinking when you say something's feminine that it's operating at the level of woman. That's not how ethnology operates. So you have to think about these as spheres of existence. If you're in the world that God created, right? I'm sticking with American ethnology here. If you're in the world that God created, this is a self-encapsulated world. So that means that the relationship between white men and white women in terms of masculinity and femininity don't translate outside of the white race, because those are civilized and evolved God determining categories of relationship. So when Adam knows that he is the master, it is indicative of the fact that other racial groups like Black men do not know that they're the master and can never be masters. Okay. So that feminine aesthetic of what may have been depreciated, or if you're drawing from complementarianism, the idea that women receive through Victorian aesthetic, right? All that's in that world. When you then go from this world and compare, say, this other world with Black people and savages, the feminine is that whole world. There is no gender delineation among racial groups of people or savage groups of people. So the feminine in relationship to that idea only exist in relationship to the master race, because the feminine is to be ruled over by the masculine, which is the entire white race. So there have been people that talk about Victorian aesthetics, the complementarianism in science, etc. Those things try to like illuminate the role that the feminine had in the white world, but they don't kind of encapsulate what's happening in the Black world, because all the people in the Black world are thought to be feminine. All of them are malformed and all of them are childlike, which is what justified the enslavement and colonization of them in the first place. And in this relationship, white women were the masters of Black men, not the other way around.
Cool, thank you. It seems like we have time for one or two more questions, if
That's
I'm
fine.
correctly. Does anybody have further thoughts, questions, ideas?
I just didn't know one thing. One of the reasons I'm so fascinated by this is because in philosophy we tend to universalize our categories. We read them all the way backwards as if our present day's understanding of gender and race were natural to the world. And what this historical research has shown, and particularly what we found with Dougal Stewart, is that that's completely false. That even the Scottish Enlightenment was affected in very real ways by the enslavement of Black people. And that enslavement of Black people dictated racial theories even here in Scotland. So it very much reverses the current scholarship that we have, not only a racial difference, but as in terms of what I study, which is the vulnerability of men, showing that racism was really a male-based phenomenon for most of human history following the Enlightenment. But I'm happy to end there to give the other presenter more time.
See. Oh, a question just came in from Hypatia Spa. Why do you think at that time biblical references were still so commonly used in this kind of discourse? Did they actually believe in them, or was that more of a conscious ideological tool?
Oh no, they actually believed in them. So you see this all across the boundaries. It's not just race. They explain science. They explain what would later become evolution. All of this is based in how they read the Bible. So that's not out of place whatsoever. I mean, even people like Teal talked about when Darwinism became more popular, talked about how the evolution of groups moved through, kind of animistic and polytheistic religions to a theistic orientation. So religion became one of the most explanatory, if not the definitive source of knowledge in the early 19th century for America. I think what's really interesting is that all of these texts that I mean, these are only two or three texts, but I mean, I have dozens. I teach a class on ethnology here that I actually teach tomorrow. And there's dozens and dozens of texts that support this interpretation. So there's not really, I couldn't find any any difference, any outliers where people introduced a different appeal or anything like that. So what we're really doing as philosophers is misstating the complexity of racism in the 19th century, and certainly underestimating the effect that racial science had, not only in terms of what we understand there to be in the United States, but also in terms of what we understood civilization and beauty to be across the Atlantic. And you're absolutely right. Like the issue here is not just physical appearance, but it's about the deformity of the body not being able to adjust to civilization. And this is really the honing in of qualities that they thought were associated with Black men. As I said, the argument that Black men were fundamentally misogynist comes about in 1857 with Samuel Cartwright. And we see that reproduced by suffragists from the 1860s to the 1880s, 1890s, when they're fighting about voting rights. And then it accumulates, of course, in the 1920s in the United States, where white women say we've got the right to vote. We're going to side with white men. We're going to form like our white women's KKK organizations, and we see ourselves evolving the race towards global power. These are all well documented historical facts, but the antecedents of it come from these ethnological tropes that are trying to draw the white race together for evolutionary uplift. And in this world, Black men become the devil, right? They're the beast that corrupted Eve in the Garden of Eden. So we're not really talking about racism. We're talking about a very specific kind of racist caricature that's drawing on what people think about the characters of men and how that is animating, right? How that's animating our American racial discourse for the last 200, 300 years.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Curry. Shelley also linked to the Bloomsbury Guide to Philosophy of Disability, which I believe your chapter in that book is what I was
Yeah.
thinking about throughout education as well, because I
Yeah.
not very familiar with ethnological methods, and
Mhm.
all I was thinking about was like how these kind of historical ways of constructing race, constructing disability, how they kind of like tangentially, but also kind of directly lead
Mhm.
to the ways that we kind of conceive of Black men with respect to disability today, where
Absolutely. Absolutely.
fundamentally at odds, like the like capital D disabled, capital P person, uh,
Mhm.
like it's constructed to be incompatible with
Yeah.
s-
Yeah.
so thank you again to Dr.
Thank you so much.
We have, let's see. So we've got another presentation, also on this wonderful panel. Up next, we have John Henry Fahey Reilly. John Henry is a doctoral candidate at Duquesne University and is planning to defend his dissertation in May this year. I just had to very actively, I don't know why, whenever I see Duquesne, I want to say Duquesne.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's it. So that was us there. And he's planning to defend his dissertation in May of this year. His work combines Husserlian phenomenology with critical neurodivergent studies to elucidate various facets about dyslexia. John Henry earned an MA in religion and a certificate in bioethics from Yale University and a BA in liberal arts from St. John's College, Annapolis campus. John Henry is a passionate teacher and recently won the 2025 Charles Daugherty Teaching Award. His presentation is titled American Eugenics, Early Psychometrics, and the Formation of Learning Disabilities.
Yeah, thanks so much, Erica, and thank you to Dr. Curry. That was an incredible presentation. Just a lot to think about. I just want to thank Shelley, and I want to thank all the previous presenters. This has just been like an incredible conference so far. I'm really just loving it. So a description about me. My name's John Henry. I've got a big beard, big brown beard. I'm wearing glasses. I'm a cis white man with short brown hair, and I'm wearing a sort of brown green cable knit sweater. I want to acknowledge that I am speaking today on the unceded territory of the Lummi Nation and more broadly of the Salish Coast peoples. And I just want to kind of give just a quick, warning. This is in many ways like a large continuation of how eugenics progresses into the 20th century from a lot of what Dr. Curry is talking about. And I think race is plays a huge role in predicating a lot of this. But I just want to kind of warn people that this does have a lot of language that's, you know, comes to people with mental impairment and neurodivergent groups and stuff like that. So just want to kind of forward that. So a quick outline, I'm just going to do an introduction, kind of do a framing questions and then a thesis. And then the argument, it's a historical argument. It's going to come in three parts. We're going to look at sort of the first sort of standardized, I guess, intelligence tests of the living. Obviously with ethnology, measuring skulls, notions of intelligence were happening there. But we're going to talk about how these intelligence tests start in France. Then we're going to jump across the Atlantic to the American eugenics movement. We're going to look at psychometrics and the role of illiteracy in the American eugenics movement. And then we're going to kind of finish off by looking at how the formation of learning disabilities comes as a sort of backlash or counter motion against the eugenics movement. So I talk a lot about dyslexia. That's where my research is. That's because I'm dyslexic, but I'm interested in neurodivergence generally and learning disability generally. But let me just give you a quick definition of dyslexia, right? A specific and persistent learning disability affecting the acquisition and development of the written language code, reading and spelling, and causing significant handicap to academic achievement and or activities of daily life. Right now, dyslexia research is under a lot of debate. Like the International Dyslexia Association just redefined dyslexia this past year in October. So it's pretty fraught right now. With that, I just want to go over some statistics over dyslexia, because I think it's important to get a sense of kind of the problems that dyslexics face in society. So we make up 6 to 17% of the population. However, various estimates would say that we make up to 47 or 48% of all incarcerated adults in the United States. The rates are probably higher in youth incarceration rates in the United States. With that, we have a 46% higher chance of attempting suicide at some point in our life compared to non-dyslexics. Studies show that dyslexics are much more likely to become unhoused compared to non-dyslexics. We're overrepresented in the addict and recovering addict population. We're much more likely to be diagnosed with anxiety or depression. We drop out of school a lot. We drop out of school twice as our rate is twice as high as compared to non-dyslexics in the U.S. I think this dyslexic might be an exaggeration, but some people think that it's only 2% of dyslexics that enroll in undergraduate programs in the U.S. actually complete their 4-year degree. With that, dyslexics, when you look at all these statistics, this isn't surprising, but dyslexics, we have much worse career prospects over the course of a lifetime. I think what's really important here is so much of the time when we focus on dyslexia, it's always just about the problems with reading and getting accommodation and teaching dyslexics how to read. And obviously, I think that's important, but I think it always overlooks the ways that there are sort of systemic problems that dyslexics are facing, number one. And number two, it overlooks problems about shame, namely shame around illiteracy or problems with reading and writing. So here's kind of the framing question. In 2010, the Emily Hall Tremaine Foundation conducted a national survey of parents, teachers, and school administrators. And it found that 7 out of 10 of the respondents, 70%, incorrectly linked learning disabilities with, severe mental impairment or mental impairment of some kind. And maybe that's surprising to some people to hear, but I would just say that, like, for dyslexics and many other learning disabled groups, that's not surprising at all. Like, we do not need a poll to tell us that. Like, that's something that we experience on a pretty daily basis. So, for example, long before this poll, when I was a child, my parent, most of my family is dyslexic. As my cousin says, like, you go to Thanksgiving, you throw a stone in any direction, you're going to hit a dyslexic. So I grew up with a lot of support and discussions around this. And my family insisted that I had this mantra of, before I go to school, I would have to say, I'm not stupid. And I would say this throughout my life. And even in graduate school, I'd say to myself, I'm not stupid. I'm not stupid. And one point for my research sort of shifted was when I started asking the question, well, why do I actually have to resist this belief that I'm stupid? What is causing me to believe that there's something inferior about me or something wrong with me? And why is this a feeling that's so ubiquitous for so many dyslexics? Like, this isn't just me, this is everyone. And what I want to flag here is, like, I'm not trying to distance us from people that have mental impairment. I just think that, like, intelligence is just kind of socially constructed in many ways. But what I'm really trying to distance myself from is how we use intelligence as a means to create hierarchies of superiority and inferiority, and how these hierarchies instill shame in different human beings. So what I'm going to do is distill these questions into two questions, right? One is, how is intelligence historically and socially constituted? And this has got a very, very long history. I mean, Dr. Curry's research is showing a lot of that history in many regards. But I'm going to focus mostly on the 20th century. And then what I want to also look into is how does the formation of intelligence as a scientific concept relate to the formation of learning disabilities? And I'm going to kind of use dyslexia as the case study here. So here's the thesis, right? Our contemporary conception of IQ or general intelligence took shape within the American eugenics movement of the 20th century. The original diagnostic categories within the so-called feeble-minded umbrella eventually fragmented and were later reclassified as various learning disabilities, developmental disorders, mental disorders, stuff like that. Um, Now, while these diagnostic categories and the criteria and views on who is able to be educated and who's not, and various educational and pedagogical techniques, all of these things have changed. The underlying stigma from the eugenics movement was never uprooted. And so that stigma has sort of inertially carried over and continues through processes of sedimentation and typification to today. And this is going to apply to many, many different groups. Okay, so let's jump in. We're going to look at part one. So like as I was mentioning, like we can see intelligence is a much older concept, but when we think about standardized intelligence tests of the living, um, the one that really kind of comes to the fore comes out of France. And so it's a weird story, but in 1882, the French establish a universal and free public school system. And about 20 years into having the school system running, there's this increasing problem of teachers complaining about kids that they just cannot teach. And some of these kids are unruly. Some of them are not paying attention. They're just not staying on grade level. Teachers don't know whether to pass them and keep them moving through the grades or not. And it gets scandalized in the press. And so some French politicians form what's called the Bourgeois Commission. You can't make this up. To investigate what's going on with these problematic kids. The Bourgeois Commission is named after one of the French senators who just was named Bourgeois. And so this is what the outcome is. In 1904, the Minister of Public Education in France commissioned Alfred Binet to identify children whose academic difficulties indicate a need for special education. So the French psychologist devised a set of tasks to assess a student's reasoning potential with a single score. So this is why the testing methods are developed that we're going to kind of see continue through the eugenics movement. It's basically to make a screen for kids that need special education, right? Now, the question then is like, what's being tested? And I'll just read this, right? It's like, after assigning age levels to different tasks, Binet called the score obtained mental age. This is the same as in educational discourses today, what we call being on grade level. So if the mental age was significantly below a student's chronological age, then a need for remediation was necessary. Basically, if we have a 12-year-old who's at the grade level of a 6-year-old, then this is where we need remediation. Binet uses a pretty coarse-grained set of diagnoses. It's binary on one level. It's just, is the child normal or feeble-minded is the term he uses. And then within the feeble-minded category, there's 3 subgroups. So there's the debile, imbecile, and the idiots. So just connecting to all sorts of presentations we've had today. And then within these subgroups, there are then, high, middle, low, and stuff like that. So this is not a normalized distribution scale. Binet is not testing for superior intelligence or giftedness. And it's not intended for adults. This is literally just a special education screen. And what I think is also important to think about here, though, is a question of how these kids are being tested. So this is just an excerpt from the approved translation of one of his books, right? Being a student of language development and holding the opinion that an intellectual development and language is so intimately involved that it may be considered as one criteria of intellectual level, Binet used 3 great planes of language development to differentiate between the mental conditions of idiots, imbeciles, and morons. When they translated the term debile, they translated to the word moron, and that's how the word moron entered the English language, actually. So according to this classification, the idiot never reaches the plane of spoken language. They're nonverbal. And the idiot is limited to the use and understanding of gesture. The imbecile understands spoken language and talks to himself in varying degrees of fluency. The moron, in addition to using spoken language, is capable of learning to read and write. So I just want to take a step back right here. Like, as I've mentioned, I researched dyslexia, but I think this is a really useful place to, on the one hand, think about how multiple different groups are affected by this kind of special ed screening and the means by which the testing is happening. But I just want to also connect it to some of Dr. Curry's work, right? Like we could see that like language is the main metric that we're measuring intelligence. Then this is not just affecting dyslexic people, right? Nonverbal autistic people are affected. Anyone that has difficulty with language is going to get sort of pigeonholed into this problem, right? And I think what's also, as we're going to see in the American eugenics movement, this also really becomes a huge, it gets sort of swept into racial issues, right? When we look at the antebellum South, right, there's all of these laws around enslaved people are not allowed to learn to read and write. You can see that in Frederick Douglass's autobiography, or Jefferson talks about it in Notes in the State of Virginia. And so, right, the status of being able to read and write is always sort of mapped onto the status of who is a human being and who's subhuman, and it's always sort of like implicitly indexing like who has rationality, who is intelligent and therefore human. And so like I think that this kind of problem is beyond just neurodivergence issues, and it has a lot of far-reaching impacts. But so this is Binet's test, right? And I just want to switch on over. We're going to jump across the Atlantic to the United States. Yeah. So a little bit earlier in 1897, a 12-year-old girl is admitted to an asylum called the Violin Training School in New Jersey. Her mother couldn't afford taking care of her, and she had a stepfather, but he refused to support a child who was not his own. And I just want to read some of the teacher reports of this girl. Her name was Emma Wolverton. She was made famous globally through a pseudonym named Deborah Kallikak, but I think it's important we acknowledge her real name. I just want to read these teacher reports. So she knows a few letters, cannot read nor count, poor memory, not affectionate and quite noisy, been to school, no results. This was a note taken the year she was admitted to Vineland. 11 years later, when she's in her early 20s, she can write a fairly good story, but spells very few words, has little idea of the use of capitals. It's difficult for her to separate her sentences. 3 years later, she can write a well-worded story, but has to have more than half of the words spelled for her. Knows very few of her number combinations. She retains a great many interesting facts connected with nature work. So we can look at this, and as we saw with one of the definitions of dyslexia, right? This is pretty characteristic of a girl that's got dyslexia, and when you look at other reports, she probably had ADHD, right? She's got problem with reading and writing, spelling, capitals. Like this is just textbook stuff, right? But what's really, really important is that the person that oversees this asylum, his name is Henry Herbert Goddard, he is the first person to translate Binet's test into English. And so he administers this test to Emma Wolverton, and his conclusion is, this is a typical illustration of the mentality of a high-grade, feeble-minded person, the moron, the delinquent, the kind of girl or woman that fills our reformatories. They are wayward. They get into all sorts of trouble and difficulties, sexually and otherwise. And yet we have been accustomed to account for their defects on the basis of viciousness or environment or ignorance. The teacher clings to the hope, indeed insists that such a girl will come out all right. Our work with Emma convinces us that such hopes are delusions. So one thing that I think is like crucial here is for Binet, he's creating the special education screen. And, while he's extremely ableist, he is still quite insistent that everyone can get educated and everyone should get educated as far as they can. And what's a huge shift is that this exact same test is being used by Goddard, but Goddard has the opposite approach, namely anybody that's going to get pigeonholed into this testing criteria is ineducable. They cannot be taught. It's not an issue with environment. It's nothing of the sort. And what Goddard is going to do is he's going to take this argument and sort of push forward a very sort of classically American eugenicist program. So he publishes a book called The Kallikak Family, a study in the heredity of feeble-mindedness. And the main character in this book is Emma. And the book is tracing Emma's family tree. And what Goddard is trying to say is that on the one side of the family, Emma has, a family with good genes, and they're upper middle class white Protestants, and they don't drink alcohol, and etc. It's risible. But on the other side, well, we have criminals who have poverty and they have sex out of wedlock, and all of these things indicate that they're morally bankrupt and they're criminals and they have low intelligence. And his argument is that it's the low intelligence, the feeble-mindedness, that is both hereditary and also overrides the good genes, and this is what causes Emma to be this problem. And he's going to frame Emma as a real menace to society. And his argument is that we need to take anybody who's diagnosed as a moron or any of the other groups, and we need to put them in asylums and incarcerate them for the entirety of their lives in order to prevent them from being criminals, from drinking alcohol and having sex out of wedlock and producing more criminals. This is what we would call negative eugenics. And what's really important is, for Goddard, this book is considered scientific proof of this hereditary theory. And so when the eugenics laws in the United States were passed, it was kind of a long story, but by 1928, probably, up to 32 states in the United States passed sterilization laws. And almost all of them are citing this book as the scientific justification for the need to sterilize human beings. So in the United States, we probably incarcerated several 100,000 people in the asylum systems. That's what Goddard advocated for. And then there was sort of this add-on sterilization movement. In the United States in the 20th century, I think we sterilized 70,000 human beings against their will. And obviously, the vast majority of them were people of color. They were very often women. I think it's crucial that we acknowledge that. This was a huge influence for the Nazis. I mean, I could go on. But that's the situation we're in, right? So this is Goddard's situation. Pretty soon after this, the Stanford-Binet test comes out in 1916. This is developed by Lewis Terman, and it's rapidly became the gold standard for eugenic screening in the United States. Terman coined the term gifted, as in gifted children, and he spent a lot of time studying gifted children. He created a sort of normalized distribution scale for his test. He added a few questions, but again, this is still based off of Binet's, special education screening program. And so for Terman, again, this is explicitly eugenicist. He's very, very interested in eugenics. He puts the quotient in intelligence quotient testing. What's really crucial here is, like, he thought there was only going to be about 2% of the population would, when you give them the Stanford Binet, only 2% are going to be, a moron or an imbecile or an idiot under his diagnosis categories. But later, when they reworked the Stanford Binet during World War I into what were called the Army Alpha and the Army Beta tests, this was a testing mechanism that tested almost 2 million people. They found that over 50% of the people they tested were actually ending up in these categories of being feeble-minded. This was largely because literacy rates were way, way lower than they realized. And if you cannot read, you're automatically going to be put into the moron category, as we saw with Binet. But there's also just language differences. People that have different syntax structures that they use at home and with their communities were not going to do well on a test that was made by upper class white men. And there was also immense cultural bias. Like, I mean, half the questions in the Stanford Binet are like trivia, basically. So, so what I want to point out here is, again, this was always inextricable from racism, right? And, like, again, when we look at how the eugenics movement took off, there's always this specter of illiteracy. And illiteracy is always going to be this thing that everyone's frightened of. They're, very nervous. We could see this in the suffragettes. In 1893, they passed this resolution where they're trying to say, like, look, there's more white women that can read and write than there are Black people that cannot read and write, or immigrants that cannot read and write, or Catholics that can't read and write, and stuff like that. So, we could see that there. We could see that precisely in, when we move out of, Reconstruction, the Jim Crow laws are instituting literacy tests, right? I mean, it's all over. I mean, the Immigration Act of 1824, what that was all about was not just xenophobia and eugenics, but it was also instituting a literacy test for immigrants. So this is something that's across the board, but it was a particularly, big issue within the eugenics movement. Let me see how I'm doing with time. Yeah, I'm actually all right. So what I want to do is jump now into basically 1925 with this guy named Samuel Orton. Now, Samuel Orton is widely credited as sort of like the father of dyslexia science and dyslexia research. He developed what's today called the Orton-Gillingham remedial method, which is sort of the main method by which dyslexic children, especially, but um, it's like how we learn to read. And it took a long time to figure out, like, there are very specific ways that dyslexic kids need to learn to read. When I was a child, I spent years under the Orton-Gillingham curriculum and stuff like that. But he also is credited as sort of like really concretizing a lot of the ways that we think about dyslexia today. And I think there's different ways we can interpret Orton. So in 1925, he is this psychiatrist. He is working in Iowa. And when you look at the eugenics movement, you can see that Iowa is actually kind of a hotbed for a lot of the sort of sterilization movement and all that. And in 1925, he's moving around and he makes a couple of discoveries. We're going to look into them. But he writes this sort of landmark book, or article, I should say. So if you look at the structure here, these are the sections of it. And in dyslexia historiography, everyone's going to point to this article and say, like, this is sort of the birth of modern dyslexia. And that's fair. And what they're always going to end by talking about is his sort of review of the literature in section 5 called Congenital Word Blindness. And he's going to talk about these earlier English doctors and ophthalmologists like Hinchelwood and Kussmaul and stuff like that. He's talking about them in this section. And so they're going to look at this and just say, like, look, he's making these connections with people that are sort of discovering dyslexia for the first time, but he's modernizing it. He's got a much better conception of what's going on. It's not a problem with the eye, etc. But in the historiography here, they're never going to talk about section 6 and 7. And section 6 and 7 are the concluding sections of this entire article. And so what I want to sort of posit here is that he is not just trying to talk about dyslexia, he's actually trying to undermine the epistemic validity of the Stanford-Binet test. And he's trying to show that these are absolutely just ridiculously bad methods of testing. And so, like, let's just take a look, right? So this is in the introduction of this article, right? He says, among those children who were reported to the Iowa State Psychopathic Hospital by their teachers as dull, subnormal, or failing, or retarded in their schoolwork, was a fairly high proportion whose chief difficulty was in learning to read. MP, this is one child he's going to focus on here, was tested with the Stanford-Binet method and showed the following rating: age 16 years, 2 months, mental age 11 years, 4 months. Therefore, the intelligence quotient was 71. During the psychiatric examination which followed, however, I was strongly impressed with the feeling that this estimate did not do justice to the boy's mental equipment, and that the low rating was to be explained by the fact that the test is inadequate to gauge the equipment in a case of such special disability. By the Stenquist mechanical assembly test, number 1, for example, he earned a score of 82, which would place him on a level with the highest 1% of unselected Army draft recruits. So what's going on here is we've got this kid, he's testing in as, depending, on the Stanford-Binet, he's getting a score of 71. And there's different ways we could read this, but, like, effectively, he is going to be diagnosed as a moron in this case, by that terminology and criteria. And Orton's seeing this and saying, like, this doesn't really make any sense. Like, this kid seems to be, perfectly capable of holding a conversation, and he does not seem to be, like, we don't need to incarcerate him for the rest of his life, effectively, because of this test. And when we give him other tests, he's doing really well. He's in the top 1% in some cases. So he's trying to say that, like, the problem here is the kid can't read. It's not that this kid is defective in some way. And so if we're going to then take this and then jump to these later sections that I was mentioning, this is kind of what Orton's going to say. He's going to say, it has been pointed out by numerous writers, some of whom I've already quoted in this report, that this difficulty, as is also true of many of the speech and auditory disturbances, is an isolated disability, is not the result of a general mental defect, and further, that often it corrects itself. Nevertheless, there is a strong tendency to characterize these children as quote-unquote defectives. Because the word defective is so constantly implied to be a general intelligence defect, I have consistently attempted to make make use of the word disability in describing this difficulty. Then later he says, I think we must challenge the Stanford-Binet method to give us even an approximating rating in these cases. So what I think is really, really important is that here in 1925, a few things, right? First of all, Orton is really showing that like the Stanford-Binet test is a completely farcical method of testing. It's just not working. It's not approximating anything that it's claiming to. And he's going to get increasingly more sophisticated arguments against the Stanford-Binet for the next 3 or 4 years. With that, he's also going to introduce this idea that this is what he calls an isolated disability, a special disability. And this is the language that we still have today around learning disabilities. If you go to the DSM, if you look at pretty much any diagnostic criteria, learning disabilities are always listed as specific learning disabilities. And part of what I'm saying is this is explicitly coming from excerpts like this from Orton. But what's overlooked in these cases is that Orton is basically trying to sort of fragment out these sort of monolithic groups in the feeble-minded umbrella into all these different groups that he's saying have specific issues where they're still educable and they still can learn to read. Well, for dyslexics at least. But he's actually going to discover a whole bunch of different other kinds of learning disabilities. So when we think about sort of the transfer out of the eugenics movement, we can see a lot of this fragmentation of at least the early versions of learning disabilities coming out of Orton and him framing these as specific disabilities. There's a lot more I can say here, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to keep on rolling. What's really important is let's just return to Henry Herbert Goddard, right? In 1928, he's very famous for retracting his beliefs on his eugenics of like, we need to incarcerate people into the asylums and make sure they never have kids, they can't have jobs, etc. And I just want to read from his retraction, which is an address in 1928. So real quick, he says, and so we come to the doctrine, not new to this association, that the problem of the moron is a problem of education and training. It can be shown conclusively that a large proportion of the morons in our institutions, both in the past and at the present time, are there because in school they could not learn to read from books, and the school had nothing else to offer. I'm going to skip the rest of the quote here, but if you look, especially in the bolded parts, what he's realizing is that, oh, actually these children and the adults can learn to read, that we can actually educate them. And his whole thesis is that they're ineducable. And so he's realizing because they're educable, it's really kind of impossible to hold this thesis that their genes hold them back from learning, that they are a menace to society because they can be taught to read and therefore they can have jobs, etc. And what I really want to point out here is that this first quote that I've got up here, this block quote number 1, when you look at the historiography of eugenics, I've read tons of, in the past couple of years, historiography of Goddard, and people always look at this retraction statement. I've not found a single one that actually quotes this block and acknowledges that the problem is actually about reading. And it's a problem of like he's switching over his belief on educability. They're always just going to go to his retraction itself. I'll quote it right here. He says, I assume that most of you, like myself, will find it difficult to admit the foregoing view may be the true view. We have worked too long under the old concepts. As for myself, I think I have gone over to the enemy. So in the historiography, they're just going to look at this. They're going to say he retracts it. There's not much thought about why he's retracting it. And one question that I always am wondering is like, well, who is the enemy he's going over to, right? You know, in the quote above, he's talking about this person named Miss Anderson, Bernstein, and Wallace. But these are also people that run asylums. They're, for the most part, eugenicists. They're very good friends of Goddard. He's been working with them for years. I don't think he thinks of them as enemies. They're colleagues and friends of his. So what I really want to sort of also add in here is sort of my final conclusion is, well, this is in 1928. The very next year, they invite Samuel Orton to talk at this very same eugenics conference, right? Now, remember, Orton is an avid, he's very against the eugenics movement. He's quite explicit on that in many places. So it's weird that he's invited to talk at this eugenics conference. And he is invited, his address is called The Relation of Special Education Disabilities to Feeble-Mindedness. Yeah, I'm pretty much out of time. So I don't know if I'm going to read all this, but what I really just want to point out is he's saying, number one, the Stanford-Binet and all the ways we're testing for quote-unquote feeble-mindedness are absolutely farcical. They're not working. As I said, he's got increasingly sophisticated arguments against that. But what I also want to point out here is that if we look at the language he's using, it is kind of interesting, right? He's talking about, it's like may we not assume that some of these cases with a history of intellectual enfeeblement were in reality physiological variants in whom methods of training adapted to their specific ways of learning might have produced inadequate minds. He talks about there's sort of just deviations in patterns of learning. And what I think is really important here is that if we read this as sort of like he's framing these as differences rather than forms of inferiority, I think that that takes Orton out of the way he's traditionally seen as sort of like creating a deficit model of dyslexia, as it's called. And I think we could sort of read him, with caveats, obviously, but we could sort of read him as a sort of proto neurodiversity and proto neurodivergence activist and thinker. And I think that that's, in conclusion, I think that like thinking of Orton in that way is helpful because I think it helps legitimate a history of neurodivergence when it comes to dyslexia. Usually when people want to phrase dyslexia as neurodivergent, scientists will dismiss that. They'll say it's, ahistorical and problematic in these ways. I think their arguments are farcical. But when we look at Orton in this way, I think it's like we can sort of see that, like, no, like this has been a theory of dyslexia from the very inception of its creation, from the very moment that it came into being as a diagnostic category. So in conclusion, I just want to say, if we're thinking back to the framing question of like, why do dyslexics feel stupid all the time? But this is also for other learning disabilities, right? That's because these diagnostic categories arose out of the US eugenics movement. And the stigma was, we would attach dyslexia, but other learning disabilities, is just a continuation of the older forms of stigma as they carry over, right? We never uprooted the stigma. We just changed the diagnostic criteria and the names, right? This is also going to involve a twofold historiographic intervention. On the one hand, it's going to be a the historiography of eugenics. There's a lot of stuff where they're not asking about who are the victims here and how would they be considered today. It's also an intervention into dyslexia historiography. And on the latter side, that's going to problematize these medical models of dyslexia. And finally, I just want to say, I think that this is helpful because I think it helps us in the neurodiversity movement think about sort of narratives that can kind of build solidarity across different neurodivergent groups. And part of what I'm saying there is that, a lot of us were in our communities, like not us today, but people in our communities 100 years ago, we were all put in the same pigeonhole diagnostic categories, and we were all put in the asylums together. And so I think that like this is a way for us to think about solidarity amongst different neurodivergent groups. But I also want to say that like I think this is really important for when we think about solidarity in other issues of social justice, right? Um, if we think about prison abolitionism, right? The asylum system in many ways, right, like was a sort of prefiguration of after World War II what became the modernized carceral state in the United States. So and when we look at the incarceration rates of dyslexics, for me, it's like this sort of obligates me to be pretty staunchly into and supportive of prison abolitionism. And likewise, if we think about Black feminists working in sort of reproductive justice frameworks, right? Like one of their main principles is like it's not just the right to not have a child if you don't want one, it's the right to have a child, precisely because, yeah, I'll stop right here. I'm sorry.
Thank you, John Henry. Can't find my applause hands. There they are. Yeah, so does anybody, it looks like we have time for, I think we started a couple minutes late on this panel, so probably time for about 2 questions. Perfect. The first one has come in from Carolyn, who asks, do you think it's better to maintain this distinction between learning disabilities from which people can learn and intellectual disabilities from which people are still typically not thought to be able to learn? Or should the discussion be reframed?
Yeah, I think the discussion should be reframed. I mean, and I think that this is one of the big strengths of the neurodiversity movement is like, I think it can help us get out of, I think these false distinctions that I think are unhelpful in many ways. I think Orton's a really good example here. It's like Binet wants to educate everybody, but he still is going to explicitly say these groups of people are inferior. Orton's never going to say that, and he's very dedicated to everyone getting the best education they can. And the people learn differently, and like these are not these are not problems where people are inferior. It's just that like there's different mechanisms by which people learn, and so we need to find the mechanisms whereby everyone can learn in their own ways. And I think that within the context of education, that's a huge and a very important way to think about how we need to reshape our education system in the United States, but across the world. Is like, these are not people that are inferior, and we need to totally change the way we think about education. So yeah, I think we need to get rid of this distinction entirely. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. And then there are two more questions, but I think they can kind of be combined. One from Hypatia and one from Melissa, who are both asking about the relations between dyslexia and other disabilities. So Hypatia asks, what do you think of the relation between, of the relation of dyslexia and hyperlexia, or of dyslexia to aphantasia, non-musicality, etc.? Should they be considered similar? And Melissa asks, I'm wondering how this analysis of dyslexia relates to other disabilities that impact spoken communication. So deafness, non-speaking individuals, individuals with unreliable speech. Currently in France, at least, dyslexia is well supported in the educational system, but individuals that require AACs, sign language, etc., remain much more excluded and stigmatized.
Yeah. So let me talk about the second one first, and I'll come to Hypatia's question. Both great questions. Thank you to everyone for your questions. I appreciate it. Um, so, I mean, I think like a lot of my research is not necessarily focused on like accommodations and like how accommodations should function and this and that. But I do think that like, yeah, like think about non-speaking communities, right? If you think about just like the way we think about language and how it maps onto intelligence, and therefore it sort of implicitly allows us to think about systems of inferiority and superiority, just think about the etymology of the word dumb, right? The word dumb today means stupid or mentally inferior in some way or another. But etymologically, that meaning only came about in the 19th century. And before that, the word only meant someone who cannot speak. And so what I think is really important there is that like literally there's something going on in the 19th century into the 20th century where it's like if you cannot speak, then you have no intelligence. Right? If you do not have the capacity to use language, then you are somehow subhuman. And again, we can see that in the deaf community, right? Like when Thomas Mann, who's largely credited as like sort of creating a lot of the frameworks for the US education system, he also like there was this very interesting burgeoning set of schools for the deaf community in the United States where sign language was taking off and deaf communities were really thriving. And Thomas Mann brought a lot of his supporters to sort of just absolutely destroy these communities and insist that deaf people had to learn to speak rather than use sign language. And this was couched in terms of they're subhuman if they cannot speak and stuff like that. So I think that, like, again, the way we think about language as a marker of being human or subhuman, as a marker of being intelligent or not intelligent, and therefore superior or inferior, this is something that tracks across different disabilities groups and it tracks racially and stuff like that. And so I think that like we need to be very careful and critical of the way we think about language as a marker of humanity. And I think that that's one answer. To Hypatia's question, yeah, I mean, I think that like all these different ways of cognition are all germane to the neurodiversity movement for me. And I would say, like, for the most part, the way I think about dyslexia is like it's a neurodivergence precisely because neurologically it is like we in what's called like declarative memory, there's kind of two kinds of memory. There's what's called semantic memory and episodic memory. And we can get technical with it, but basically like a lot of dyslexia is sort of we have a predisposition to sort of privilege episodic memory over semantic memory. And that's going to have downstream effects like our problems with verbalization, downstream effects like our difficulty with reading and spelling and stuff. But also, it will explain why so many dyslexic people will purport to have like hyperfantasy and stuff like that. Like visual thinking and stuff like that is a huge part of the dyslexia community. And not all dyslexics have it, but it's big. So that's how that would kind of relate. I don't know if that fully answers, but yeah.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, John Henry. Thank you to Dr. Curry. This was such a great panel to be part of.
Thank you. That was wonderful. John Henry, Tommy's presentation was also wonderful. Erica, you did a fantastic job chairing. Thank you very much. So we'll take a break now until 2:00, and we will come back to our symposium on AI, racism, fascism, ableism. Okay, see you at 2:00. Thank you very much.